dogfight with enemy fighters.
There's 4 of them. 1 o'clock high. They're coming around. Watch it.
On the outskirts of the Merced, California, an American war hero
Too
was
fast.
shot
6
5
o'clock up.
times
Coming
in
in.
his own
Baronacci.
front by his own young son. The dead man was 40 years old.
Got an engine on
His
fire.
name was Master Sergeant Hewitt Tomlinson Dunn. He was the only airman in the entire 8th Air Force who had ever flown 104
Three planes, 9 o'clock, coming around.
B-17
Keep it on,
flying
boy.
fortress over Nazi Germany. He had earned the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying
breaking it
Cross,
low. I'm breaking it
with
low.
1 oak leaf cluster, and the airman
Coming around
with
here.
21
10 o'clock.
oak leaf
I don't know,
clusters.
2 o'clock.
You have never heard his name.
I got my sights on
There
them.
is
Check that
reason
B-17, Chuck.
for
3
the
o'clock.
next 60 years.
Fire.
The United States Air Force, a handful of local newspapers, and a whole generation of quiet men in uniform would work together. Without ever holding a single meeting or signing a single order, to make certain you would never learn the truth of what happened that night in Merced. This is the truth, and to understand why he died the way he died, you first have to understand why he lived at all. To understand that, we have to go to a small wooden briefing room on a wet English airfield in the winter of 1944. We have to talk about the chair. Hewitt Tomlinson Dunn was born on the 14th of July, 1920, in the coastal city of Norfolk, Virginia. His father was Phineas William Dunn. His mother was Annie Lee Hewitt, and it was her family name that would go on the middle of his own. Hewitt, the mother's name, made into the son's. He grew up quiet. He grew up ordinary. He was the kind of boy who did not draw attention and did not seek it. In the few photographs that survive from before the war, his eyes are steady and slightly amused, as if he already knew something the camera did not. He was married young, to a woman named Dorothy Mary Sirlich. In the same year he enlisted, 1942, he was 22 years old. He walked into a United States Army recruiting office and signed his name on the enlistment papers. He did not ask to be a pilot. He did not ask to be an officer. He did not ask to be safe. He asked to be a gunner. In the winter of 1942, this was not a career. It was a sentence. The gunners of the American heavy bombers had, statistically, some of the shortest life expectancies of any military role in the European theater. They flew at 25,000 feet in unpressurized aluminum tubes filled with high-explosive bombs and high-octane fuel. They fought German fighter aces at closing speeds of 600 miles an hour. They froze. They bled. They died in numbers the newspapers back home never printed. Hewitt Dunn knew all of this. He signed anyway. They sent him through the aerial gunnery school, weeks of firing tracers into desert skies from the back of moving trucks, weeks of learning to identify a Focke-Wulf 190 from a P-51 Mustang in the quarter-second before one of them killed you. They pinned the silver wings of an aerial gunner onto his chest and gave him 3 stripes. In December of 1943, they put him on a troop ship bound for England. He was assigned to the 569th Bombardment Squadron of the 390th Bomb Group, 13th Combat Wing, 3rd Air Division, the 8th Air Force. His new home was a wet, cold airfield in the Suffolk countryside called Framlingham. Station 153, he was 23 years old. He had never fired a gun in anger, and he was about to fly 104 missions into the deadliest airspace on Earth. The morning of the 29th of January, 1944, was cold and grey over Suffolk. It was the kind of morning that felt like it had been raining for 100 years. At the briefing, they told him the target. Frankfurt, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Steel and chemicals and machine tools, anti-aircraft batteries thick enough to darken the sun, fighter squadrons on standby. At every airfield within 200 miles. It was the largest single-target attack the 8th Air Force had ever put into the sky. They walked him out to a B-17 flying fortress called Buckshot Annie. 10 men, 12,000 rounds of ammunition, two 2,000-pound bombs in her belly. They put him in the tail. If you have never seen the tail gun position of a B-17, imagine this. Imagine crawling on your hands and knees down a narrow aluminum tunnel, past the waist gunners, past the ball turret, past the small trap door of the escape hatch. Imagine kneeling into a plexiglass bubble the size of a phone booth, tilted backward with your knees under your chin. Imagine the temperature outside is 40 degrees below zero. Imagine you are wearing an electrically heated suit, and if a single wire in that suit shorts, you will freeze to death in 90 seconds. Imagine 2.50 caliber Browning machine guns 4 inches from your face. That is where Hewitt Dunn spent his first combat mission. They crossed the channel. They climbed to bombing altitude. When they crossed the German border, the sky began to open up around them. Because of where Buckshot Annie flew in the combat box that day, most of the fighter attacks passed her by. Buck spent 6 hours in that plexiglass bubble at 40 below. He watched, through his rear-facing gun sight, as other B-17s exploded in the formations behind him. He watched contrails of Messerschmitts weave through the falling bombers like sharks through blood. He came home, 1 mission down, 103 to go. 27 days later, on the 25th of February, 1944, in a hospital ward in the United States, a young woman named Dorothy Dunn gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Donna Lee. She was Buck's first child. At the exact hour of her birth, her father was over the city of Regensburg in southern Germany, hunched inside another flying fortress. It was his 9th mission. The target was the Messerschmitt aircraft plant that was building the fighters trying to kill him. He would not meet his daughter for more than a year. By April of 1944, Buck had flown 30 combat missions in 90 days. A full tour. Most men who reached 30 missions did not talk about it. They packed their footlockers, drank themselves stupid, and got on the first troop ship home to hold the babies they had never met. Buck walked into the squadron office and requested a second tour. His crewmates asked him why. He said, "I want to be here for D-Day. I don't want to miss the greatest event in history." They stared at him. They had no answer for that. He finished the second tour by summer. He requested a third. This was almost unheard of. Heavy bomber gunners did not fly 3 tours. Heavy bomber gunners were not supposed to live long enough to fly 3 tours. But by the winter of 1944, the men of the 569th had begun to understand something about the quiet sergeant from Framlingham. He was not brave in the way the movies were brave. He was not loud. He did not tell stories in the mess hall. He did his job. He came home. He did it again. And the more missions he flew, the more the men around him began to whisper the same word, Iron Man. It started as a joke. By January of 1945, it did not sound like a joke anymore. By January of 1945, Hewitt Dunn had flown more heavy bomber missions than any other American airman alive. He was 24 years old. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe had changed the way it killed American bombers. For the first 2 years of the daylight bombing campaign, German fighters had attacked from behind. It was the natural thing to do. You come out of the sun, you drop down on the tail of the formation, you pick off stragglers. It was hunting. It was clean. But the Focke-Wulf pilots learned something in the winter of 1943. They learned that a B-17 Flying Fortress has 13 50 caliber machine guns, and 12 of them are pointing everywhere, except one direction. Straight ahead, straight into the nose. So the Germans stopped hunting from behind. They started coming head-on. At a combined closing speed of 600 miles an hour, a Focke-Wulf 190 covers the distance from beyond visual range to the nose of a fortress in about 4 seconds. 4 seconds. That is the length of time you have to identify the aircraft, lead your target, and fire. 4 seconds to save your crew. The commanders of the 569th Bomb Squadron looked at the numbers and made a decision. The best gunner in the group would no longer sit in the tail. He would sit in the nose. They moved Hewitt Dunn. They pulled him out of the tail bubble and put him in the plexiglass greenhouse at the front of the fortress. Chin gun below his boots, cheek guns to his left and right, a bomb release toggle under his thumb. He was now what they called a toglier, half gunner, half bombardier, the eyes of the aircraft, the first man in the crew who would see the Germans coming. There is a room in the hangars at Framlingham that still exists today. It is now part of a museum, but in 1945, it was the briefing room of the 569th Bombardment Squadron. Wooden benches, cigarette smoke thick as fog, a big black curtain covering the map at the front of the room. The old airmen of the 390th tell this story, and they have been telling it for 80 years now. Buck always sat in the same place, second row, against the wall. When he sat down, he tilted the chair back onto its 2 rear legs and leaned against the plaster. It was a habit. It was the way he settled in. But by the winter of 1945, it was more than a habit. It was a signal. The men had figured it out over the course of a year and 100 missions. When the curtain came up and the target was revealed, they watched Buck's chair. If the chair stayed tilted back, casual, 2 legs off the floor, it meant Buck had looked at the target and decided it was a milk run. Easy flak, easy fighters, home for supper. If the chair came forward slowly, deliberately, all 4 legs settling onto the wooden floor with a small quiet sound, it meant something else. It meant somebody was not coming home tonight. The men of the 569th were officers, lieutenants, captains. Buck was a staff sergeant. He did not outrank a single one of them. But when the curtain came up, they didn't look at the map. They looked at the chair. There was a mission in the spring of 1944 that Buck never spoke about. The target was Leipzig, the Erla Maschinenwerk factory. It was one of the German plants still building Messerschmitt 109 fighters at scale, and the 8th Air Force wanted it gone. The 390th Bomb Group put 28 fortresses into the sky that morning. Buck was among them. Somewhere over central Germany, the American fighter escort turned back. They had run out of range. There was a 10-minute window before the next escort would arrive. The Germans had been waiting for that window. Roughly 40 Focke-Wulf 190s came out of the clouds in a single wave. They went in head-on, the way they had learned. Cannon fire, 20mm and 30mm shells. A single hit from a 30mm round could tear a wing off a fortress. 2 B-17s of the 390th did not come home that afternoon. One of them was called Sitting Pretty. The other was called Yankee Doodle Dandy. 20 men. That is what the 8th Air Force meant when they used the phrase rough mission. 20 men who had been eating powdered eggs at 4 in the morning were not eating supper at 8 in the evening. 20 empty bunks, 20 footlockers to be inventoried and shipped home, 20 telegrams to 20 mothers. Buck returned to Framlingham that night. He ate dinner in the mess hall. He did not talk about Sitting Pretty. He did not talk about Yankee Doodle Dandy. He went to bed. He flew again the next morning. This is a thing that older men understand about war, and younger men do not. It is not the missions where everyone dies that break a man. It is the missions where 20 men die, and you eat dinner, and then you do it again the next day, and the day after that. For 14 months, there was a mission to Wilhelmshaven that winter. Wilhelmshaven was a German submarine port on the North Sea coast. Its anti-aircraft defenses were among the worst in Europe. The men called it, simply, hell. The 390th climbed to 28,000 feet that day, 5,000 feet higher than the mission plan called for. It was a bad altitude for accuracy. It was a good altitude for staying alive. They did not stay alive without cost. Somewhere over the target, a burst of flak found the fortress. Buck was flying in. One of the shell fragments went through the aluminum skin and into one of the crewmen. It punched through his flight suit, through his ribs, and into his lung. The man was drowning in his own blood at 28,000 feet. Now, understand something about the geometry of a flying fortress. From the tail gun position to the nose of the aircraft is about 60 feet. 60 feet of narrow aluminum walkways, ammunition boxes, hydraulic lines, and open bomb bays. In combat, at altitude, in an unpressurized aircraft, you do not leave your position. You do not crawl through the guts of a B-17 unless somebody is dying. Buck put down his guns. He unhooked his oxygen. He clipped a walk-around bottle to his flight suit, a small green cylinder with about 6 minutes of oxygen in it, and he crawled forward through the fuselage, over the ball turret, past the radio compartment, through the bomb bay on the narrow catwalk with the ordnance hanging on either side. He found the wounded man. He plugged him into a fresh oxygen line. He pressed a compress against the sucking chest wound. He held the man against his own body to keep him warm. He stayed with him until the aircraft landed. The wounded crewman survived. He went on to finish his tour. Think about that for a moment. The Iron Man of the 8th Air Force, the man of 104 combat missions. And when a fellow airman was dying beside him at 28,000 feet, the first thing he did was set down the guns. That, in the end, is a truer measure of the man than any tally of enemy aircraft. Late in the autumn of 1944, on a mission whose exact date has been lost to the paper records, Hewitt Dunn shot down a German fighter. It was a Focke-Wulf 190. It came in head-on, the way they always did by then. Buck was in the nose. He led the target. He squeezed the triggers. The German went down. Confirmed kill. Entered into the record of the 569th Bombardment Squadron. It was the only confirmed kill of Buck's entire career. 104 missions. Thousands of rounds fired. 9 trips over Berlin. And exactly 1 enemy aircraft destroyed by his hand. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because in the popular imagination, in the movies, we measure a gunner by kills. We measure him by tally marks painted on the fuselage. But that is not how the men of the 569th measured Hewitt Dunn. They measured him by the number of times he came home. They measured him by the number of men who came home because of him. They measured him by the chair. The most flown gunner in the history of the 8th Air Force killed exactly 1 man in the sky. And that, in the end, may be the most important thing about him. The details of this next mission are not my details. They are the recorded testimony of Sergeant Wilson Shearer, pilot, and Sergeant Richard Dick Cowles, tail gunner, of the aircraft in which Buck flew that morning. They spoke about it decades later, when they were old men, and they still remembered it exactly. The target was Uerdingen in Western Germany. The date was the 28th of January 1945. Buck was in the nose that day as Toglia. They were on the bomb run, straight and level. This is the most dangerous phase of any bombing mission. You cannot maneuver, you cannot climb, you cannot dive. You fly in a rigid line at a rigid altitude for 2 solid minutes, so the man in the nose can do his job. The Germans knew this. Their flak batteries were calibrated for it. Buck came on the intercom. His voice, they said, was calm. It was the same calm voice he used to order coffee. He said 6 words. He said, "Hang on, they're going to get us." 20 seconds passed. Then 3 shells burst around the aircraft in a pattern. Not 1, 3. Directly on top of the fortress, directly on top of Buck's prediction. The first shell exploded off the nose. It rocked the aircraft. The second shell came up through the floor of the radio compartment, tore through the ceiling, and detonated above the aircraft. The concussion was so violent that the entire B-17 jumped upward in altitude and then fell, dropped, like a stone, out of formation. The radio operator was thrown across the compartment. Cables hung from the ceiling like severed spaghetti. The oxygen system was gone. The 2 waist gunners were down. The ball turret gunner was screaming into a dead intercom, trapped in his sphere below the aircraft with no electrical power to bring him up. The third shell exploded just behind the tail, right behind Dick Cowles' seat. Cowles said, decades later, that he heard the metal of the shell casing pass through the air 2 feet behind his skull. The pilot, Wilson Shearer, put the aircraft on autopilot. Cowles crawled forward through the wreck of the fuselage with a walk-around oxygen bottle. He revived the waist gunners. He pulled the ball turret gunner up by hand. He made his way to the radio compartment and hooked the radio operator back into a fresh oxygen line just as the man began to come to. And in the nose of the aircraft, Hewitt Dunn, the man who had predicted this exact catastrophe 20 seconds before it happened, pressed the toggle and released the bombs onto the target. He did not leave his post. He did not check to see if the crew behind him was alive. He was the toggler. His job was to drop the bombs. He dropped the bombs. There is one more detail from that mission that I want you to hear. Buck's fortress fell out of formation. A stick of bombs from another B-17 in the group above them dropped through the sky. Those bombs passed the open bomb bay of Buck's aircraft at a distance of about 8 feet, Cowles said years later. If they had dropped 0.2 of a second earlier, we would have blown into 1,000 pieces, and there would have been nothing left of us for anyone to find. 0.2 of a second. That is the margin by which the most flown gunner in the history of the 8th Air Force did not die that morning over Werdingen. On the 21st of March, 1945, Hewitt Dunn flew his 94th combat mission. For reasons that were never written down, he did not fly in the nose that day. He did not fly in the tail. He did not fly in the waist. On this one morning, the only morning in his entire career, he flew as top turret gunner. The top turret sits on the spine of the B-17 just behind the cockpit. It is a plexiglass dome with 250 caliber Brownings pointing upward and outward. The man who mans it also serves as the flight engineer. He monitors the fuel. He watches the engine gauges. Buck climbed into the turret at 4 in the morning. Somewhere over the North Sea, at 25,000 feet, his oxygen mask came loose from the regulator. At 25,000 feet, without supplemental oxygen, a man loses consciousness in 15 to 20 seconds. He does not know it is happening. He simply goes to sleep. Buck went to sleep. He was a large man, a former football player. His body slumped inside the top turret in such a way that his head jammed against the framing, and no matter how the crew tried, they could not lift him free to reattach the mask. The pilot, First Lieutenant Melvin Myers, unbuckled from his seat. He climbed back to the turret. He carried no walk-around oxygen with him. He was going to fix the problem in a few seconds and get back to his controls. He did not fix the problem. He passed out on top of Buck. Now there were 2 unconscious men, one of them the pilot, at 25,000 feet in a B-17, flying straight and level in enemy airspace. The co-pilot, First Lieutenant William McVicker, made a decision that had no precedent in the history of the 569th. He broke formation. He nosed the aircraft down into a steep emergency dive. He gave up the defensive protection of the combat box the mutual firepower of every gun in every fortress around him, and he took the aircraft alone into the sky, at low altitude, over occupied Europe, hunted by Focke-Wulfs, so that the men in the back of the aircraft could get enough atmospheric oxygen to breathe. He did this for one man, not for the pilot. The pilot could have been replaced. Pilots were, sadly, replaceable. He did it for the gunner. Because by March of 1945, in the 569th Bombardment Squadron of the 390th Bomb Group, Hewitt Dunn was not replaceable. Not by anything. Buck woke up at 10,000 feet. Myers woke up beside him. The aircraft returned to Framlingham that afternoon, with all 10 crew alive. 94 missions down, 10 to go. On the morning of the 6th of April, 1945, the men of the 569th Bombardment Squadron gathered in the briefing room at Framlingham. Buck sat in his usual chair, second row, against the wall, 2 legs off the floor. The curtain came up. The target was Leipzig. Leipzig, the city where Buck had shot down his one and only Focke-Wulf. The city that had eaten Sitting Pretty and Yankee Doodle Dandy on that terrible morning in May of 1944. The city that everyone in the 569th had learned to fear. The room watched the chair, slowly, deliberately, in the way older men move when they know they are being watched. Buck brought the front legs of his chair forward. He set them down on the wooden floor. 4 legs, all 4. Down. The room went silent. Every pilot, every navigator, every bombardier in that room read the signal. They understood what Buck had just told them without saying a single word. Leipzig was going to be bad. 37 fortresses took off from Framlingham that morning. Buck was in the nose of an aircraft called the Great McGinty, serial number 4338663. His pilot was Melvin Myers, the same Melvin Myers who had almost died beside him in the top turret 2 weeks before. This was Buck's 100th combat mission. They crossed the coast of Holland. They crossed the Rhine. They climbed to bombing altitude. They turned onto the initial point of the bomb, run over Leipzig, and nothing happened. The clouds were thick. The flak was thin. No Focke-Wulfs came out of the sun. No Messerschmitts rose to meet them. The entire mission, every one of 37 aircraft, dropped its bombs and turned for home without a single loss. 0 aircraft down, 0 men killed, 0 men wounded. Buck had read the chair wrong. For the first time in 100 missions, the man they called Iron Man had predicted death, and death had not come. He was glad to be wrong. You could see it in the photograph they took of him that afternoon on the tarmac at Framlingham. The ground crew is around him. They are grinning. 2 of them are lifting him onto their shoulders. He is smiling, not the small, quiet smile from the pre-war photographs, but a real smile, a young man's smile. He was 24 years old. He was the first and only man in the 8th Air Force ever to fly 100 combat missions over Europe in a B-17. He would fly 4 more before the war ended, and then he would come home. Let me tell you what Hewitt Dunn did. 104 combat missions, 26 of them as a tail gunner, 2 of them as a top turret gunner, 1 as a waist gunner, 75 as a toglier and nose gunner. 9 of those missions were over Berlin. 1 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. His decorations in order: the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster, meaning he received it twice, the Air Medal, the standard decoration awarded for every 5 combat missions flown, with 21 oak leaf clusters. The average life expectancy of a B-17 in the 390th Bomb Group was 33 missions. Buck flew that number 3 times over, and then some. He was 24 years old when it ended. He had a wife he had barely lived with. He had a daughter he had never met. He had a war that had lived in his body for 14 months and was not going to leave. He came home, and this is the part of the story where the trouble begins. The war ended in May of 1945. Most of the men who had flown with Hewitt Dunn went home and tried, in whatever way they could manage, to forget. They took off the leather A2 jackets. They packed the flight logs into cardboard boxes and pushed the boxes onto the top shelves of closets. They got jobs at hardware stores and insurance offices. They married the girls who had waited. They tried for the rest of their lives to look forward and not back. Hewitt Dunn did not do that. Hewitt Dunn stayed in. His first marriage did not survive the war. He and Dorothy divorced. In 1947, he married again, a woman named Peggy Anderson. They would go on to have 3 children together over the following years. A son named Jeffrey, a son named Craig, a daughter named Jamie. He put on the new blue uniform of the United States Air Force when it became its own branch in 1947. He kept flying, not as a passenger, not as an instructor at a desk. He kept flying as what he had always been, a gunner. They transferred him eventually to the 328th Bombardment Squadron of the 93rd Strategic Bomb Wing. His new base was Castle Air Force Base in the flat farmland of Central California near a small town called Merced. His new aircraft was the B-52 Stratofortress. The B-52 was a different animal from the Fortress he had known. It was jet-powered. It could fly at 50,000 feet. It carried nuclear weapons instead of iron bombs. It had a tail gun position with 450 caliber Brownings clustered together, Quad 50, they called it, controlled remotely from a small station near the tail. And Hewitt Dunn, the man who had once frozen inside a plexiglass bubble at 40 below over Frankfurt, became one of the men who taught the young airmen of the new Air Force how to use those guns. The men who worked with him at Castle Air Force Base in those years remembered him a particular way. They said he was quiet. They said he was reserved. They said he was a handsome man with black hair combed straight back. They said he never talked about the war. Only on formal occasions, when he wore the dress uniform, did the other men see the ribbons. They bought a small farm on the outskirts of Merced. 8 acres of dry California ground, a house, a barn, a front lawn that ran down to the road. From the outside, it looked like the ending of a good American story. From the outside, the Air Force records from the last year of Hewitt Dunn's life are not romantic. They are administrative. They are the small, dry notations of a career going wrong. In late 1960, his superiors at Castle Air Force Base filed a performance evaluation on him. The words they used were specific and, in the language of the military, damning. They wrote that he was argumentative. They wrote that he was unsocial. They denied him a promotion he had been expecting. There is no record of him complaining. There is no record of him confronting anyone. He was, as always, quiet. But the men at the base began to notice that Master Sergeant Dunn was spending more and more of his evenings at the non-commissioned officers' club, drinking. Not loud drinking, not fighting drinking, just steady, methodical, hour after hour drinking. The kind of drinking a man does when he is trying to put something down inside himself that will not stay down. We did not have the words for it in 1961. The phrase post-traumatic stress disorder did not enter the American medical vocabulary until 1980, almost 20 years after Hewitt Dunn died. In 1961, if you were an old bomber, gunner who could not sleep and could not stop thinking about the boys in Sitting Pretty and Yankee Doodle Dandy, if you closed your eyes at night and saw the boys who had jumped out of burning fortresses without parachutes, because burning to death was worse, nobody had a name for what was wrong with you. You just had another drink. You waited to feel normal. You did not tell anyone. I want to say something now to the older men who are watching this. I want to say it clearly, and I want to say it plainly. What comes next in this story is not a defense of Hewitt Dunn. It is not an excuse. There is no defense for what he did that night on the front lawn of his farm in Merced, California. There is no excuse. A man makes his choices, and a man carries his choices, and no medal that was ever pinned to any chest anywhere has ever unmade a single one of them. But the story is also not a condemnation, because to condemn him, to reduce him to what in his last 10 minutes on earth, is to erase the 60 feet he crawled through a wounded fortress to save a dying crewman over Wilhelmshaven. It is to erase the chair. It is to erase the 20 seconds of calm on the intercom over Werdingen. The story is both things at once. It has to be. That is why it is worth telling. On the evening of June the 15th, 1961, Hewitt Dunn and his wife Peggy went out drinking together at the Non-Commissioned Officers Club at Castle Air Force Base. They came home late. To the farm on the 8 acres. We do not know what the argument was about. There is no report. There is no diary. There are no witnesses who ever spoke on the record about what was said between a husband and a wife on the last night of a marriage that had lasted through the birth of their children and the passage of 14 years. We only know what happened next. Hewitt Dunn beat his wife. He beat her in the front yard of their farmhouse under a California sky in June. He knocked her to the ground. She lost consciousness. When she opened her eyes again, when the world came back, she saw two things in the fading light. She saw her husband standing over her, and she saw her son. He was standing on the front lawn. He was holding a rifle from inside the house. He had it raised. He had it aimed at his father. He was a boy. He was defending his mother. He pulled the trigger 5 times. Hewitt Tomlinson Dunn, the only man ever to fly 104 combat missions in a B-17, the man who could predict flak 20 seconds before it came, the man whose chair had been read by 200 pilots, died on the front lawn of his own farm at the age of 40. He was killed by a rifle held by his own son. He was killed on his own front lawn. He was killed defending nothing. The local newspapers in Merced County, California, ran a small item about the death of Master Sergeant Hewitt Dunn in the week that followed. The item did not say what had happened. The item said there had been an accident with a firearm. One newspaper, I am not going to name it, because the reporter who wrote it is long dead, and there is no purpose in a public shaming that arrives 60 years too late. One newspaper said that Master Sergeant Dunn had been teaching his young son the safe handling of a rifle when the weapon had discharged. That is not what happened. The men of the old 390th Bomb Group, the pilots who had once watched Buck's chair, the gunners who had once flown behind him, read those newspaper accounts and did not believe them. Something was wrong. Something did not fit. Some of them called the police in Merced. Some of them wrote to the Air Force asking for details. They got nothing. They got the sound of a door closing. You have to understand what year it was. 1961. The Cold War was hardening. The number of American troops in Vietnam was climbing every month. The Air Force was in the middle of the largest peacetime expansion in its history. The B-52 program, the same program Master Sergeant Dunn had helped build, was the backbone of American nuclear deterrence. The last thing the United States Air Force needed in the summer of 1961 was a headline about one of its most decorated living veterans being shot to death by his own son after beating his own wife. So there was no headline. The men of the 390th were told, in that quiet way the government has of telling you things, that this was not their business. The story did not go away because someone hid it in a safe. The story went away because 1,000 men in 1,000 small offices, in 1,000 small moments, decided that it was easier not to tell it. That is how a man gets erased from history. Not with a shredder, with a shrug. Master Sergeant Hewitt Tomlinson Dunn was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 28, Site 3675, full military honors, the flag folded 13 times into the tight triangle with the field of stars showing, the rifle detail firing 3 volleys of 7 rounds each, 21 rounds in total, the traditional 21-gun salute. The bugler standing at a distance, playing the 24 notes of taps in the still Virginia air. His widow, Peggy, received the folded flag. She would live another 59 years and die in 2020 at the age of 96. She never remarried. The son who fired the rifle was never charged with a crime. He was a minor. He had acted in the defense of another. The case was closed. He went on to grow up, to grow old, to bury his own brother Jeff in 2002 and his own half-sister Donna Lee in 2010. He currently, the way his father had carried the war. The 390th Memorial Museum at Parham Airfield in Suffolk, England. The same airfield the Americans had once called Framlingham still exists. You can visit it. If you go in one of the rooms they have preserved, you will find a recreation of the briefing room of the 569th Bombardment Squadron. Wooden benches, a large map of Europe at the front of the room, a black curtain that once hid the target of the day, and a chair. A single wooden chair in the second row against the wall. It sits on all 4 legs now. Nobody tilts it back anymore. Nobody needs to read the signal. The men who read the signal are all gone. But if you stand there long enough in the quiet, you can almost see him. A young sergeant, 24 years old, black hair, steady eyes, waiting for the curtain to come up. Hewitt Dunn flew more combat missions in a B-17 than any other man in the 8th Air Force. That is a fact. It is written in the records of the 390th and in the National Museum of the mighty 8th in Savannah, Georgia, and it will remain true for as long as those records exist. Hewitt Dunn beat his wife on the last night of his life. That is also a fact. Both of these things happened. They happened inside the same man. They happened inside the same skin. We do not have to choose between them. We only have to remember them. Because the men of the greatest generation were not statues. They were not the black and white photographs on the walls of American Legion halls. They were living men who did impossible things in the sky over Europe and who came home carrying wounds that nobody could see and nobody had a name for. Some of them survived those wounds. Some of them did not. Master Sergeant Hewitt Tomlinson Dunn did not. His name is on a small white stone at Arlington, Section 28. Site 3675. If you go, you can find it. It is one of 400,000 stones on those green Virginia hills, and it looks like all the others. But he was not like all the others. He was the man in the chair, and now you know his name.